All right, I'll get started while we wait for Chris to pop in here real quick. Before we start anything, I just want to show you this picture. Last year, we opened up a center at the New Orleans Children's Hospital, the rehabilitation hospital, at New Orleans Children's Hospital, and we had a game day, and this is one of my favorite pictures that came out of that game day, because this young man had not been gaming for really ever because of his disability, and we had the Microsoft Xbox adaptive controller and a couple of switches, and he was gaming for the first time. And I really just love this picture because I'm just so happy, and the kid is so happy. And I'm also wearing the exact same shirt as I am in this picture.
You've washed it, sis, right?
I didn't say that.
After that splendid introduction, I'm Chris Power. I'm the Vice President of Able Gamers.
You have to stay this way.
I'm supposed to walk this way, so I will walk this way.
They told us we can't go from that chair to that chair, but neither of us wanted to sit down.
That's right. So I lead the games user research side of Able Gamers. I joined the organization about 3 years ago. I have about 15 years of experience in user experience and inclusive design. And I work with a team, specifically Greg Haynes, and a team at the University of York, where I have a day job as an associate professor.
And my name is Mark Barley. I'm the founder of Able Gamers. This is my 6th GDC that I've done. I've also been privileged to present at the White House under the Obama administration and more places than I can even count. I will say, because my friend Linda's here, when I started Able Gamers 15 years ago this year, I actually converted an EverQuest 2 fan site to the very first Able Gamers site. None of this would really be possible without this great team.
So we have Jen Beeston, who's a research fellow with Able Gamers and a PhD student at the University of York. Paul Cairns, who's our scholar in residence and a colleague of mine, a reader at the University of York. Greg Haynes is our lead user researcher who has contributed to the APX material you're going to see today, as well as Craig Kaufman and Steve Spawn and Jesse and Kelso, who are members of our team at our headquarters in West Virginia.
But we asked them for pictures and they forgot to send them.
So when we talk about players with disabilities playing games, we often think about putting information into the game and getting information out. We often talk about flexible presentation and flexible controls, and we will talk about that today. But when we boil accessibility down to something like that, it's often the case that it oversimplifies it, because games aren't like other interactive technologies. When we talk about accessibility in other areas, there's always a task that we're trying to complete. Something like, I'm going to get my money from a bank machine, or I'm going to pay my taxes on a website. Games aren't like that. Games are a lot more than just putting information in and getting them out. They're about playing a game, and what does that really mean? What it largely means is that players are going out seeking an experience. We know that with game designers and with anyone who works with players, that they're always talking about the player experience as being the core thing that we're worried about. The fact that someone can move a character doesn't mean that they're playing the game. Just because I can explore the universe as Ryder walking around in Andromeda, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm having fun or that I'm experiencing the game the way that I want to. When we talk about experiences with players with disabilities, we've taken to describing them as accessible player experiences, by which we mean a player is having the experience that they want to have in a game, free from barriers that are as a result of their disability.
Slow down.
I will slow down. So when we start talking about potential players with disabilities, what are we talking about in terms of an audience? Because people often ask us, well, how many players are we really talking about? When we look at different statistics around the world, we found various data from about 2011. The most recent data that we were able to find was in the US Census, where it talked about approximately 13% of the population in the US having a disability. Now, that is a particular classification that's been used for quite a long time in the census. When you look at new data, the newest data that we have is the Canadian Disability Survey, not because it's my home nation, but simply because
Wait, you're Canadian?
Wait, really? Hey, there we go. So in the Canadian Disability Survey, there's a much broader definition of what a disability is. And there you find definitions related to things like dexterity or flexibility, or things related to age-related disabilities, but also things around mental health, for example, which are now reaching into the broader classification, and things that we'll talk about today as part of our user research. As a result, the estimates that we put is somewhere
So what
between...
that means, see, this is my part.
No, I was just going to give the final percentage. It's somewhere between 13 and 22%.
So what that really means is that if you look at this information from the ESA, so the ESA says about 64% of people have access to gaming equipment in their home right now. That means that there are 27 to 45 million people with disabilities in the US that have the equipment that they need to play. Are they playing?
Well, it turns out that actually a large number of players with disabilities in the game now. This doesn't mean that every player with disabilities, of course, is out there playing, but it's certainly much larger than people typically think. We've been reaching out to the global population to try to build out a player panel, a group of players who can participate in game testing and user research. We have a large number of players from North America, from Europe, and across the world who want to participate in your game research. We offer this as a service through Able Gamers free of charge, where we can pair you with individuals who meet various characteristics, either in terms of who they are or what they play. We currently have somewhere between 400 and 450 people that are active in the panel, and the data that I'm going to talk about today is just about 400. The groups of people with disabilities, we ask them to complete a demographic questionnaire. And when we look at that demographic questionnaire, we find that we have about 50% of people who have some sort of physical disability in either their upper limb or their lower limbs. We also have a large number of people with sensory disabilities, which are the traditional sensory disabilities that we think about in terms of hearing and seeing, and people with color vision deficiency, so people who have alternate ways of seeing color. And we also have a large number of people who process information differently, where we have people with mental health difficulties, for example, people with learning disabilities, people with cognitive disabilities, or broader neurodiversity, so people with autism or people with high-functioning autism. The really interesting thing is we often classify people in accessibility circles by their disability. When you look at a lot of the materials online, we often talk about people in silos or in categories. People are either blind or they have low vision. What we found was largely across our disability population, most people did not identify as having a single disability. Now, this has important implications for our design, because one of the most common things that we hear from designers is, I don't want to choose. I don't want to have to choose between one group of players and another. And what we've been working towards is a broader understanding of what options people use, and in particular, the surprising result that people overlap in the types of things that they want and need. So as part of player panels, we ask a large demographic survey which includes information about the technology that they use to access games. We have about 46% of players at the moment who use key remapping. Now, the numbers I'm giving you, they've actually remained really stable. So we've been collecting data for about 2 years now, and after the initial tranche of players joined, we ended up finding that our numbers have settled down. So we believe that these are fairly representative of the current population of players who are playing games. Now, we had about 10% of those players who do not have physical disabilities who are using key remapping. So it gives you an idea that some people are co-opting these things in order to play games in a different way. It becomes even more stark when we look at subtitles and captioning, where we only have about 14% of players in the panels who have either low hearing or sign language using deaf people. Over 40% of our players use subtitling. This shows that this is a key piece of technology that's allowing people to customize their experience, either related to their disability or simply because they want to tune their game.
Yeah, the data literally said that, for example, people with cognitive disabilities, people that are learning English as a second language, women turn on subtitling more than men. And so when you hear that statement, well, subtitling are for people who can't hear, our data showed that that's not true, that subtitling is for people that need subtitling.
We also find this in things like recoloring, where people want to distinguish one piece of information from another. We often link this to people with color vision deficiencies, so people who are colorblind or have alternate ways of seeing color. However, we only have about 4% of people in the panels who actually identify as having that, and 20% of people are turning on recoloring options. When I mentioned this at another conference, when I presented that number, someone came up to me and said, I know why they're doing that. And I got really excited because I thought they were going to tell me. And they did. They were like, it's because in Fortnite you can see enemies better.
Oh.
And I went, Oh, it's absolutely true. That's really cool. And actually, when we talk to people, people are co-opting these things for broader aspects of gameplay. So when you think about accessibility options, it's actually not just about disability. It's about a broader part of your design in games.
Microsoft's own research actually says that 80% of people who use Windows and Office suites use an accessibility feature, a feature that they specifically put in for accessibility in order to make their work better. 80%.
So we asked people a bit of information about their flexibility of control. How do they modify different pieces of input into the game? And there we found a wide variety of different types of controllers being used. People typically talked about when they used a customized controller, something like a customized mouse or a custom controller that's been built for them, and also things like alternate controllers like the quad stick where you have a sip and puff interface. However, tied to that, you'll also see that key remapping becomes an important part of gameplay. Whenever we use one of these things, it's important, these types of alternative inputs, key remapping recurs again and again with it as something that's necessary to be able to change the controls from that standard controller over to the new one that's coming in. We also talked to people about how they flexibly change the presentation in their games. We had, of course, many people talking about captions, but we also found people talking about text enlargement, changing the contrast of different aspects, including text. We had people talk about the importance of alternative alerts, so vibrations, for example, or having sound alerts that go along with visual, or in some cases, having visual alerts that tell you about events that are happening in the environment when the sound is off. One of the most famous ones that we'll talk about later is the sound ring in Fortnite that's typically used on mobile, but now has been transferred over to desktop and a console as an important part of the design that was for people who necessarily didn't have the sound on, either because they were on a train, or because they were playing late at night, or because they were my kids trying to hide the fact that they were playing games. So more importantly, though, we had the opportunity to talk to our players about how they value gaming. There's very little information in the gaming space about why players with disabilities play games. And if we think about things, it might be that we make some very base assumptions about why people play games. And me as a user researcher, the most important thing for me is to talk to players and see if there is a difference. So we went and talked to 122 people. We put out a survey where we asked people that exact question: why is gaming important to you? We also asked in person at PAX East a set of attendees who did not identify as people with disabilities. And as a result, we were able to compare the information that was provided by our disabled players as well as by people who did not necessarily identify up front as being players with disabilities. When we did that analysis, we found that there was a number of themes that emerged over time. And we found that people did gaming for largely the same sorts of reasons. They did it to connect with others. They did it to benefit from games played. And that was an interesting one because sometimes it was about skills and sometimes it was about the opportunity to potentially learn something new. We also found that people wanted to divert themselves in different ways. They wanted to escape into a world that others had created. Now, I want to emphasize that that's not necessarily about escaping disability, because we heard this across our groups. It was about escaping into something that someone else had created, about being able to leave the real world behind and become immersed for a period of time. Perhaps one of the nicest things that came out of it was the fact that it was a piece of shared culture. People saw games as art. That was something that they compared to things like literature and movies and going to museums. Places where often people with disabilities are excluded due to the types of things that are used in communicating information, games didn't have those. They were able to share culture with their peers in a way that often they were not allowed to otherwise.
So like, for example, even in this room, let me ask you guys a question. Who here plays games? Good. I knew this was
Good,
gonna
that was
work.
good.
Yeah.
That was a good question.
So let me ask though, so who here plays more than one game? And who here looks for a friend and then goes and plays the game that that friend is playing? What if it's even not your favorite game? You still do it, right? Because you're connecting with friends. You're wanting to be with that person. The game is just the bar you went to. But the reality is you made that choice to be with that person. And that's the same for a player with disabilities. There's no difference. They're just connecting with their friends. The bar is the game.
That's right. And one of the things that echoed throughout the data was that it was about enablement. It was about enabling people into a space. The thing that people with disabilities identified differently than our non-disabled players from PAX East was that they felt that games enabled them to play with their friends on a level playing field, where they may not be able to do that in the real world. In games they were able to. And this came through really clearly in our data. And it was a really positive thing to hear, and something that we communicate to you now as designers, that your technology is not just about playing and fun in games, but it really is a massive enabling technology for people to do things that they may not be able to do otherwise.
The mechanics of the game tell you what you can do. I can jump no higher in the game than my completely wheelchair-enabled friend because the game doesn't allow it. So that's the beauty of games. I'm looking at Linda for this because, I started Able Gamers as from an EverQuest. And, EverQuest and MMOs are really special to me because they are these lives that you can kind of jump into, but we're all bound by the game and we're not necessarily identified by our disability.
And when we look at multiplayer play, we found that players were playing not only with their online friends or real friends in real life, but they were jumping on with strangers to play because it's something that they do just to get some social activity. And they also are part of large clans and guilds. So we find that these players are largely playing the same types of multiplayer games that others do. And as a result, the myth starts to fall away that disabled players are playing single-player games in their homes that are self-paced. Our players are playing large-scale, commercial, AAA titles that are multiplayer games. They sell millions of copies, and they're being sold to players with disabilities now when those options are available. And indeed, when we talk to players with disabilities, they identified as gamers. So we distinguish between gamers and players. Gamers we see as a broader identity, and some of our players with disabilities actually said, no, I'm not a gamer, and I don't want to identify that way. I'm not part of that culture. It is simply something I do, but I still play games. But we did find that for over half of our players, it was their primary hobby. It was the key thing that they did. 60% nearly identified as gamers, and they even distinguished between whether they were hardcore gamers or casual gamers. And we had about a third each. We then had a typical play session of over 2 hours, with nearly a quarter of our players playing for over 5 hours in a typical play session. Our players are people who love gaming, and they do it either as part of their lives and part of a broader set of hobbies, or as a key part of their lives.
So how did we create the accessible player experience? So most of you should have a deck of cards in your hands. I've actually seen some of you thumb through it, so it's really exciting. Want to kind of take you on the journey of how we got here. So the current accessible practices, and look, I wrote Includification, I'm part of this, is that they're heavily based on checklists. Checklists are really great at the end of your pipeline to make sure you've potentially done everything right, but they don't actually tell you what you need to do. Checklists, and the way we're doing it right now, it focuses on not creating experiences. It says, hey, you need to have closed captioning. But if you make the text a 6, sure, you checked the box that you had closed captioning, but no one can read it. It stifles innovation. Some of the most creative people in the world are in this room, mainly because you chose to come here, and you guys are creating great things all the time. The way we currently do it, it says this is what you must do. It prescribes a solution, but you may actually have a better way.
And fascinatingly, accessibility is one of the only places in the world that we still use rules for design, where we tell you what you can and cannot do. Most designers have moved on from that and focus on a more design thinking process, where they try to build empathy and understand their players, and then move into design, then test and iterate. Yet in accessibility, we still largely focus on meet this checklist and you'll be okay. And what we're challenging in this presentation is that that paradigm needs to change.
And it really doesn't have player data built in. So when we did APX, when we did this, we came in and we said, traditionally there's these silos, and as you alluded to, we don't fall into those silos. We also started finding that different groups of people needed the same thing. And so we said we can simplify this idea and bring it all together.
So what we did was we felt that we needed to build a stronger database about what people use and to try to build out from what is happening right now in the industry. And what we asked players, building on the successes of the last 15 years of beginning the journey of accessibility in gaming, is to talk to players about what were the top 5 accessibility options that they looked for in games. And when they came back with 510 answers. In any other piece of technology that I've worked in, I get 3 words. In this, I got 510 people, or 155 people providing 510 different answers.
And some of them wrote tomes. Tomes.
I mean, most of the time, in any sort of survey that you do, you usually expect to have sort of open answer questions mostly skipped. This, we literally had paragraphs of text that we were having to sort through.
I felt bad for Jen because she had to kind of go through and parse out what the person was actually saying so that she could put it in the right thing.
That's right.
Like, I guess that's what it means to be a PhD student, right?
That's right.
So what did they come up with? So they came up with this idea we found of this access and challenge. So I want to talk about access and what this means. They were looking for controller personalization. The vast majority of them were looking for changing the way they input into the game. They wanted alternate channels. They wanted different ways. They're always turning on or looking for features to get the information out in a different way. They wanted alternate inputs. They needed to plug or wanted to plug something in that wasn't standard. Clear text. This is that thing about checkbox, I have closed captioning, but it's 6-point font at the bottom. Recoloring options, as we alluded to. They were looking for clear visual channels. Is there a spelling error?
No, thanks, no. But I'm curious because I'll forget by the end when you're asking questions. Alternative channels, what does that mean?
We will.
So we'll get to that. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. But just to preempt the question, so alternative channels, we're talking about different modalities. So providing information through a different sense in some way, either enhancing it or replacing it.
Clear visual channels, the ability to know what's important on the screen and potentially get rid of the things that aren't important. MMOs were always great for this because you could turn down the render rate and get rid of all the waving grass so you could see the quest object. Clear audio channels, and games do this pretty well. I don't want the music, it bothers me. Let me turn that up, let me turn that down. And lastly, the ability to change the HUD itself. Let me figure out how to get things. And so the access loop, this is what you guys are always as game developers working on, is this to create this loop, this flow in it. And right now we're going to build this out a little bit so you guys understand it. So a player action and understanding the state of the game. So access really is about all of the game that's not the world or story that you've created. The ability to make that next decision, the ability to take in what just happened.
And so this is really where we traditionally think of accessibility as sitting, because we often think in terms of either motor disabilities or perceptual disabilities of different kinds, sensory disabilities. And this does tie into that because we found that largely without these sorts of options, you couldn't move on in the game. You couldn't take those actions that you need to do. But it turns out that it's a lot more than that.
So after everyone's able to kind of get information in and out of the game, we started seeing these challenge options. So the challenge options, you want me to jump on this horse, you want me to do this jump puzzle, you want me to solve this thing. And so these were performance options. They were looking for ways to potentially slow it down or an assist for something.
These are our traditional twitch options that we talk about, things that make the game tuned to the person's skills.
A skip option, giving me the ability to just not do this. I hate jump puzzles. If in the first part of your game it is a jump puzzle, I'm done. I put it down. You could tell the greatest story. There could be $1 million on the other side of the jump puzzle, and I'm just leaving it there.
One of the things we often look at now is being able to skip QuickTime options. So QuickTime events, which became very popular around 2014, and then everyone started asking in 2015, why the heck are we doing this? Now we're starting to see that those have become skip options in games as well, and especially for many people who aren't able to press a key really, really quickly over and over again, they're really essential. And we see that, for example, in Spider-Man this year, where you could replace the QuickTime options with the movie play of the ideal path through it so you could still get the story.
training options. So I play every once in a while when I have a few minutes to be able to play games, I play Overwatch. And training options are important because I don't want to debut my diva because I have no idea what I'm doing, but they have this beautiful world where I can go and play and over again and get good before Craig tells me to not log in anymore because I'm terrible at it.
And when you tie into that many players with disabilities will have different configurations when they go into games, either of their controllers or of the types of settings that they need those opportunities to practice. And that's what we were hearing, that they wanted to learn their controls or learn their settings that they've changed before they enter into the game, as an example.
And lastly, progression options. I did finally do the jump puzzle to get the $1 million. Give me the opportunity to save that so I never have to do it again. So they were really looking for ways to make sure that all of their hard-earned progress was saved.
And for people with cognitive disabilities, it was largely about trying to capture that progress that has happened that they need to understand but haven't necessarily retained. So things like journaling or quest pointers provide information to the player so they can review what they need to do next.
So now we have this complete loop. This is what all of you guys are doing, which is the player takes an action, the state of the game changes, understanding that new state, making the decision, taking the decision loop. And so you see that there's blue ring, which is your access ring, always turning. And then there's this orange little side ring, which is where your challenge stuff comes in. So as we start talking and we start talking about the patterns and we start talking about the deck of cards, understanding where you are in this loop gives you a real good clue of what set of cards you should really be focusing on.
And when we look at the type of information that people were giving us, we asked them alongside the priority question, where were there situations that worked really well for them and where were there situations where they had games that they couldn't play? When we talked to them about the types of games they couldn't play, almost always it was an access option that was missing. While we found the complete range of options we've just presented to you in games where they were able to play well as things that they valued and made it a good game for them, when we looked at those situations where they couldn't play, it was almost always due to an access option. And so this gave us the cue that really access has to come first. They have to be able to get around that player loop. And then once they can, we can start tuning that experience. And we represent this with the APX pyramid that's now on the screen, where on the bottom layer you have to have your access options in place, and then a set of challenge options that modify the obstacles, either the performance, the cognitive, or the emotional challenge that happens in the game. And then once you've resolved those items for the individual, they can have the accessible player experience that they want to have. So as part of this, what we've done is we've built out a pattern language. We wanted something that took this data that we've discovered over the last year or so and build out something that's as visible and as useful as guidelines can be, but do it in a way that pushes design to the left. Something that allows generative design where you're able to take advantage of your design knowledge and innovate new accessibility. So what we've done is we've set, for example, or to start with, a set of 12 access options. And they look at, in particular, that player loop and how do we provide that flexible control and presentation. Now, each pattern, such as second channel.
I was going to make a point, but you
Oh,
won't.
I'm sorry, you can make a point.
Yeah, so I've been doing Able Gamers for 15 years, and to the point where you made about moving it to the left and why it's important, so many times I've had game companies, big game companies, come to me 6 weeks before release and say, hey, yeah, so we want to make something accessible. And there's that whole like bug curve that we all know, which is like if you think about it way to the left, it's accessibility or the bug is real cheap to fix. But 6 weeks before you release a title, it's really expensive. So when we took this on, the idea was to try to give you guys language that let you move these thought processes before you've even made a single line of code. And now accessibility is cheap to include versus a Blizzard title. 6 weeks before release, reaching out to me, and I'm going like, oh yeah, good luck.
So what we've tried to do is we've tried to encapsulate these in design patterns. Now, each pattern comes with a design problem. That design problem captures what players in general will encounter in your game that may be a problem. So for example, second channel, which taps into the alternative channels we were talking about earlier, is the design problem is that players are either unable or were unreliably able to take in information through a particular modality. So they can't see or hear some information reliably. We link that to a set of drivers. This is where the disability side of things comes in, where we link it, for example, to players who are blind or who have low vision, who cannot necessarily see the information on the screen, but also people who have hearing disabilities or are sign language using deaf people who maybe need either a replacement in the form of captions or an enhancement of some kind to some auditory content where we need to provide either a visual or haptic enhancement. And finally, players who are possibly in a noisy environment where we try to push out to a broader player base where they need either visual or audio information in an alternative way. So when we move on and we look at how do we try to encapsulate this for all of you, it's important that we also provide a set of examples in a design solution. And that design solution, first of all, comes in a general form. Players can select additional channels of information via different modalities. I am not telling you to put captions in. It may be that in some cases you don't need those particular captions because it's not speech content, but you still need some audio enhancement happening in your game. And as a result, this is a very broad set of design options, and you need help thinking and innovating and ideating around them. And the beauty of design patterns is we can find the best examples in the industry and provide them for you for ways to inspire in your game. And I'll pass to Mark for the second channel examples.
So let's talk about some second channels. One of the ones that's really great is Madden 2018. So Madden uses haptic to help you make the perfect kick. It'll do vibrations when it needs to, when you're in those sweet spots, so that you get an indication not only visually on the screen, but you're getting that second channel that tells you this is the time to do it. Another great one, Street Fighter 2. There are blind competitive players of Street Fighter because every single move in Street Fighter has a sound associated with it that is unique to that move. So they can competitively play this game because they memorize the soundscape and they know if I hear a whoa, I need a
Exactly.
right. One of the ones you alluded to, Fortnite. This is one of the breakout amazing second channels. So they did this because mobile, and I guess you play Fortnite on a bus and at school when you're supposed to be doing your math homework. And so you see this you see the sound ring. The sound ring around it gives you a visual indication of the sound around you. So you can see footsteps and you can see flames. And while I've never played Fortnite, I think those are important. You have kids.
So one of the really nice things about this example is the fact that this was largely invented through good design. It was thinking about what the players needed and what was the design problem that was being solved, which is where we've tried to position the patterns. And that's one of the reasons that this and the Madden example earlier are really nice examples, because they are really about creating really interesting and innovative designs, even though they're fulfilling an accessibility aspect of the game.
And then what we think of as potentially a second channel, which is this has a voiceover associated with it, and it's just a simple stylized closed captioning is what I like to call it when they do it like this. Another great example, this is one of my favorites, Left 4 Dead 2. They have sounds that are really important for the gameplay. And there's the option to turn on, and I know they're really small, what I like to call the brackets, which gives you a text indication that something is about to happen.
So you have things like environmental sounds, like the fact that there's a groan and something is moving towards you, or the fact that gunfire happens around you. And these sorts of indicators allow someone who can't hear to be able to identify that soundscape that's very important within the game. It also has the traditional types of captioning that we expect for speech, but they're enhanced in different ways. And this is one of the best examples of captioning that's happening in the industry right now.
It's also an example of clear channel because you can turn parts of it on and off if you don't need certain parts
That's
of the
right.
captioning.
It's a really
You'll learn it as you go
fantastic
through your stuff. But now, because we've been doing this every time we see a game or we hear people talk about a game, it's been happening all GDC so far. We whisper to each other, "Oh Oh, that's a helping hands pattern.
Oh, we got some clear text
Oh,
there.
look, a moderation in all things.
Oh man, we got some same controls but different. We're very odd. It's
yeah,
okay.
it's just,
So
speaking of same controls but different.
speaking of same controls but different, you see what I did there? One of the other aspects, so we've just talked about something that's about that flexible presentation, and we wanted to highlight probably one of the most important ones for flexible controls, and that is the idea of having same controls but different. Someone needs a different set of controls, so we need a way to provide them a way to do exactly the same thing as players using standard controllers. So in this case, it's about the players cannot effectively use a set of controls in the standard setup, and this covers a wide variety of different physical disability design aspects where it can be either a full remapping, which of course is the most ideal, but also some specifics like the fact that you can either toggle or hold a control, which might be quite important. So having auto run as opposed to having to hold a particular control. Thank you very much.
Numlock key for every MMO out there.
Yeah, exactly. Every numlock key you can imagine, but also my personal favorite, Shadow of War, where I ended up with basically a hand that couldn't open after running around as Talion for too long. We also have things like the fact that a player may need a simpler control scheme for some reason. And as a result, we might provide that, and we see that in things like NHL for quite a long time now, having the 1994 set of controls as an alternative for people who don't want all of the detail.
In HL?
Is that what I said?
Is that hockey?
It's hockey.
Is that a thing?
It's a thing.
Canadians. And your design solution.
So in the design solution, of course, it's the ability to remap some of the controls. Now, this might be just one control or a full set of controls. But again, we're not telling you this is the way you have to do it, because each game is quite different. A nice example where we had some problems with control this year was Spider-Man, where there was a lot that had to be done with the 2 sticks and a lot of that had to be done with multiple triggers. And they weren't able to be remapped, which made it very difficult for people who weren't able to use the full range of motion in both of their hands or didn't have the strength. And as a result, being able to remap those would have been very important.
So let's see some examples of this. Now you have the standard stuff like in Injustice 2 where I want to just change everything around, and I can. You have in Nier Automaton, this game does this really well. Camera as well as horizontal camera and everything.
There are options that we're not sure why they're there,
Yeah,
but we're pretty sure there's a reason. Like the fact that you can, instead of just the vertical camera, remap the horizontal from left to right. And you can remap also all of the zoom settings as well, which is really nice.
Then you have Splatoon 2. Motion control is oftentimes very hard for a player with disabilities. Splatoon 2 allows you to choose between motion control or using your controllers, and then they let you remap it from there. We talked about the toggle versus hold. When you go into Mass Effect Andromeda, you can choose, I want to click on and click off, or I want to click, hold to get something done. In Overcooked, this is one of the ones that's most creative to me. It lets you map the left side and the right side of the controller, but it also lets you throw another controller in and remap it as well, so you can actually use 2 controllers and it'll see it as one.
And so that might be something that you would have, for example, in co-play, where you have someone playing beside you, which taps into one of the challenge patterns that we're going to move into now.
We're not moving into that one.
We're
That
not.
one's helping hand.
So we have the APX challenge design patterns, which are really about modifying the different types of challenges in your games. And it's either performance challenge, so things like Twitch, being able to do very precise movements or very fast movements to relate to different events. The emotional challenges that someone might encounter, either because of things like jump scares or surprise, or being able to manage different aspects of very strong emotions and characters, or problem-solving challenges, so our traditional puzzles. When we start looking at this set of patterns, we have things like bypass, and we talked about that as being a really important thing to a lot of our players, the skip options that were in there, and essentially providing ways to skip different parts of content that people don't want to engage with because they cannot successfully engage with it for some reason. Now, this covers a wide variety of different design drivers, and some of them are physical, some of them are cognitive, where people cannot necessarily react as quickly as they want to in a performance or Twitch type of challenge, where they might want hints, for example, to be able to skip a particular challenge, or to be able to, for example, when dealing with a particular strong emotion, be able to skip over a cutscene that might cause difficulty. One of the really famous things that I tell people about this particular one, and I'm not bashing the makers of Heavy Rain, but I really struggled with the game Heavy Rain and only played about 20 minutes into it when something fairly traumatic happens. Now, because of who I am and because of my mental health, I really struggled with that game. When I presented these patterns to a young designer, he said, well, I'm going to challenge you right now and tell you you shouldn't be playing that game. And I said, okay, why is that? And he said, well, that's an important part of the story, and you should have to experience that to enjoy the game. To which I said, okay, but that means you're not selling that copy to me. And indeed, even though I'm sure they're great games, I haven't bought a single title from the people who made Heavy Rain. And when I see it, I go, no, that's probably not a game for me. To which his response was, well, what are we supposed to do about it? And I said, well, we have a pattern called moderation in all things, which is a different one than this, where you might change the way I engage with it. Well, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Have you skip it? Well, maybe that's one thing. Well, what am I supposed to do? Flash up something that says, look away now? And I went, well, why not? And he said, wait, what? And I said, well, you've probably been trained that accessibility is about rules. But in fact, you're the designer. It's your game. If you want to put a bypass in, you can. If it's not acceptable for you to do that, we have another set of patterns to think around the problem to find alternatives that reach that balance. And it changes the discussion of accessibility from a positional argument where it's the player versus the developer to a negotiation of the designer trying to find ways to make it so that players can engage with their story and have an experience in them, which, as an added advantage, probably means some more people will buy your game.
What, selling games is important?
Quiet, you.
What? So let's look at some examples of a bypass pattern. One of them is Ratchet and Clank. So at the beginning of Ratchet and Clank, it will, I believe, actually ask you a question on what you want to do with these things. And you can say, I just want to play them as movies. And it plays them as movies. You can evenly skip them. This is really important, especially in the cognitive disability world, where they might not be able to take in the information. It might just be too much. They just want to play the game. I'm playing this stupid little Family Guy iPad game, and they have all these little cutscenes in it, and I could care less. I'm just like, skip, 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 skip. Just let me match the shapes together. That's all I really want.
But for a player with cognitive disabilities, it may be essential that they not engage with that simply because it may overwhelm them in different ways.
Spider-Man QuickTime events. Again, you alluded to this. They let you just skip them and they make them as movies or little cut scenes.
So my son loves those. I hate them because I'm really bad at them.
This game is really, really great. I can never say the name
Infernium.
of it. Infernium. They let you turn off everything. The creator made a really good story and he made a really awesome game, and none of these things were really important.
So you can turn off, for example, the enemies if you don't want to have any particular combat and remove those performance challenges. This is something that we're often told by developers they can't do. And the question is, okay, that's fine, that's your choice, but if you want someone to hear your story, if that's the important part of it, is that a way that you could have someone engage with it by removing some of those? And we're actually seeing more games come on the market that have this as an option where you can simply explore the world. There was one we were told about on Monday at another conference, and it was a ghost mode that you could enter into.
And you could explore the entire level in ghost mode before you actually did the level. So you could there's no surprises. I know what's going to happen. I will say before we move from bypass, if you do put bypasses in your game, please do not make them like something like this. Yo, I see you're having trouble, want to skip it? Because that's really offensive.
One of my favorites where you can do that is when the Riddler is insulting you with Batman. Because he actually teases Batman, but you end up with the ability to skip forward through the Riddler puzzles, and actually it ends up doing it in quite a respectful way.
But I did see a game that said, it looks like you're having trouble. Yeah, because you designed it bad.
Thanks, Clippy.
Right.
So one of the other ones that we're going to talk about is one that people often don't think about, and that's those training options that we were talking about. And these are places that people can practice and fail. They're places where people have the opportunity to either practice their skills and develop them up, or the ability to test out different settings, which is really important for people with different controllers. From the drivers, we have not only physical disabilities, but people who have cognitive disabilities, or people like me who are just not very good at some games and need to practice again and again before they can get the moves down. Thank you, Street Fighter, which I'm still really bad at. But
I
it's
still
simply
can't play
giving...
Diva, don't worry.
Okay, very good. It does give people, the solution though is to provide people either tutorials or sandbox levels or a variety of different things that you are far more creative at coming up with than me, in order to allow people to have those areas to practice. So for example, you have an Assassin's Creed where you can do some different types of things, which is very different from having an open sandbox level.
Some other really great examples are Rocket League. I don't know who here's played Rocket League. It is the most fun, weird little game ever. It has some beautiful sandbox, and actually Able Gamers uses Rocket League to train new players on how to use the controllers that we give. We have a progression path when you use a quad stick, which is a sip and puff. It's a very complicated controller designed for people who are quadriplegic, and you use only your mouth and your breath. Rocket League is the first game that we master because it teaches you how to use the controller, and it has such great training spaces. Another really good one is Mankind Divided. They have tutorials for the stealth, they have tutorials for cover, and you can bring them up anytime you have to do something again. So you can go, oh, this is real stealthy, I need to remember how to do that. And you can rerun the tutorial right there.
So when we look at these different patterns, the idea is that they link together. They're not a checklist of 22 things that you should run through. Instead, they're a way to start thinking about your design in a holistic way. There's something that take accessibility away from the approach of telling you what to do and what not to do, and instead providing an interlinked language where you can start having discussions with your teams. We've seen these used in studios where people bring them in and begin talking about different aspects of their game, using them for ideation. One of the most exciting things as a UX designer is to see people putting Post-its all over them, which made me really, really excited. But
I did send him a picture, and he literally made a giddy girl sound.
I was just like, yay! And it was really, really fun because not only were they doing that, but they were using it as a way to evaluate their own ideas, where they would see, okay, we think that this solution covers off all of these different patterns that we see. Maybe that's not a bad solution because it covers a lot of different design problems that we may run into.
We saw a developer who walked up to a friend and said, you know, that thing that we're working on, we have a second channel problem because when the thing does that whatchamacallit, we're only using sound for that. And so we talked about the language and things like that. By just saying, and we went over second channel, and by saying, hey, we have a second channel problem, you didn't have to understand the nuances of the disabilities that cover them. You know what the design pattern talks about and what you need to do as a solution. By just saying, hey, we have a second channel problem, and you know what we really need? We need a way to put a helping hand on that as well. In that one simple sentence, I've told him volumes about whatever it is we're designing, simply because you now have a tool set in your hands, all of you, that gives you a vocabulary and a language to share these ideas.
And while it's driven by data from players with disabilities, which is something we're really proud of, we've tried to frame it in terms of your language of design. And one of the things that accessibility lacks across many technology industries, but most importantly in games, is we lack that general language that we can take into design sessions and start talking about it. So that first of all, the sets of options that I've discussed here today with Mark, and also the patterns that we just had presented with all of the examples, provide you with that language to begin having that discussion with your own teams.
So we gave you free stuff. So I hope that we can bribe you for some good reviews, but more importantly, I hope you take them to your studios. If you need more, I highly recommend you come spend some money on ablegamers.org. Know that everything that we bring in goes right back to our mission, so you are really supporting a great cause. Our cost on them is $4.25 because we had them printed in the US because Chinese New Year fell in a really bad time,
really awkward time
to get
for
them
us.
here. I do have one more announcement because this is really exciting. So we know that we're on to something really great here, and we're announcing, and we have little flyers for anyone who wants one, that we're doing a certified APX practitioner course. So in the fall, we are doing a 2-day certification where we do a really deep dive into how to use APX, how to bring it into your pipeline, your workflow, and how to, so the learning objectives are really important, which is how to spot accessibility issues during design, how to suggest solutions, and most importantly, how to win arguments with producers who don't want to spend the money to do that. I feel like the third objective is less and less every day because the industry is really seeming to wake up, but I know I still want to arm you with that so that you can win every time.
So one of the things that we've talked about quite a lot today is bringing them into your teams. If it's training that you want for your teams, we will come to you. So if you want to have a chat about your studios engaging with training around the APX system, by all means come and talk to us afterwards, and we have some flyers for you.
So that's my Corgi. You can follow her on Instagram at LilyBeanCorgi. But any questions? And thank you guys.
Thank you.
Dude, 50, right on. We're perfect.
Boom.
We wanted to be done 10 minutes before, and it was literally 50 and 17 seconds.
All right, so you have lots of time for me to ask questions. One really short one, will your APX course be online?
So at the moment, the way it's going to be designed is going to be an in-person 2-day course. We'll hope to iterate it to be online,
Okay.
but we just can't figure out how to do
Where?
it right now. Sorry?
Where?
Where is it online?
What? No,
Oh.
you said it's going to be in person.
Okay, so we're working on that all right now. We're in the process of designing a course. We're
Okay.
hoping next GDC on Monday and Tuesday, we actually hold an APX at a hotel nearby. But we'll be holding it at various events, and if we start seeing clusters, we'll go ahead and start getting rooms and stuff like that. We're still working that out. We're a tiny charity. We're doing our best.
So most importantly, the studios at the moment, we've had a great deal of interest of people wanting to train their teams because they want to be, we're seeing a major shift in the industry, and maybe you're all seeing it as well, of people wanting accessibility buy-in across a team. So while accessibility specialists no doubt will still continue to be important in the industry, we want everyone having a buy-in. And so we're seeing a lot more people coming to us, and that's probably where we're going to be delivering in the autumn, is in studios.
Okay. So the second one is a bit longer. I find that the dev teams that I work with, because I work in community, the dev teams I've worked with, they're actually pretty open to accessibility, and they've made changes mid-stride, God bless them. Where I'm seeing some of the challenges is amongst the players themselves. Why should people have an easy way? This is supposed to be a challenge. Why do I have to do it the hard way and other people can just skip to the end? Now, I know how I handle it, but I'd really like for you to share how you guys would suggest
So
handling
I suspect you and I handle it the same way.
it. I use rude words.
Oh, then we do. We absolutely do.
We do it
then.
exactly
ban
the same
people.
way.
So I don't ban people because I don't have that power. You never gave it to me. So the reality is, look, I bought the game and I'm playing the game. If you want to play it really hard, you be you. I don't care.
And if we find that argument is happening within design teams, it's one of the reasons that we talk about challenge as part of this, because it's about tuning an experience for an individual, and they can tune their own experience and have the experience that they want to have, because it's not about making it easy. It's about making it often challenging for themselves, but not impossible. So we often talk about the challenge patterns and the challenge pieces of design about moving the impossible to being possible.
And challenge, like what's hard, what's a challenge for you could be completely different than what's a challenge for me or a challenge for you. So the reality is, I tell those players to just do what my grandma said, is mind your own damn business, and move on, because look, we're never going to solve that problem of like, you know, I got every achievement. Great, you have no friends. I get it. Move on. Other questions before I get snarkier?
Well, I'm gonna
You
sit
promised
down,
you wouldn't.
then I'd do some more snark in my day. Actually, I make games for kids, and I was wondering, when you guys were developing this, what kind of age ranges were you working with? And I particularly work with preschool kids, which is a whole...
So most of our players are over 16. So that's the line that we draw. Most are over 18. We actually have a range, and the majority of the players in the player panels fit between 18 and 35. But we do have players ranging from 16 up to over 65. We have a handful of people who are
The reason
over
for that is
65.
paperwork.
Part of it's paperwork, part of it's about holding information regarding young people that we don't want to do as a charity. And in fact, by US law, we're not allowed to hold data for children under 14.
Under 13.
Under 13.
But to that point, like the solutions and the things are still apply to the work that you're doing. Your challenges are just very different compared to mainstream. Hi.
I was wondering, since you brought up at one point that you had different information for how women might use this, or that this is for America or Canada, do you have more intersectional information about how this affects different diverse groups or different countries?
So we've done some analyses around that. We primarily focused around disability and assistive technology use, and that's where we've tried to detect whether there's any real patterns within the data. I've done a variety of different cluster analyses, and it's really messy. People are really complex. So while we can make some broad statements, such as we did in this, regarding the numbers of people that use them, trying to say there's this type of person that uses these sorts of options is not something we can do really cleanly. And I really am reluctant to do so as well, in all truth, because it pulls away from this type of approach and pushes us back into different types of buckets potentially, which we want to try to avoid.
Is there any sort of an accessibility issue then, though, about people who can afford extra accessibility or?
That is potentially an issue, and that's one of the reasons that our charity our primary mission is getting people into the game, and we provide grants to players with disabilities to be able to buy the equipment they need, because those are serious issues, especially around purchasing equipment. So please donate Table Gamers. That would be fantastic. But we also don't collect any information around things like income or employment or things like that. We primarily focus around gameplay.
Any other questions? Anyone? Awesome, we did it.
We did it. I'm getting
Thank you
better.
guys so much. We appreciate it.